Hey everybody, welcome back to my coverage of the PogChamps 3 tournament. This is the first championship semifinals match. We're in the home stretch, and it is Ludwig versus Sardoche. I think Sardoche is the clear favorite here. He shut out his quarterfinals match. He took it 2-0. Ludwig tied his quarterfinals match and won in tiebreakers. He won that 2-1, and Sardoche is the clear rating favorite. He's got over 200 hours of chess also in the past 2 months, which is just crazy. That is an insane amount of studying, especially for someone who is new to chess. So I think he is definitely the favorite. Ludwig also has been studying a lot, but I think that Sardoche's amount of studying deserves some recognition. But in order for Sardoche to make it to the finals, he first has to make it through Ludwig, and he's not going down without a fight. So let's just see how this game turns out. Sardoche has the white pieces. The first game he starts with d4. We've seen him play the London. We've seen him play the Grob. So looks like he's going for a London setup this game. Starting with d4, and Ludwig plays f5, the Dutch defense. Sort of a maybe slightly dubious defense at the master level, but this is not the master level. So, you know, the Dutch defense is definitely playable here. We have bishop f4 continuing that London setup, knight to f6, e3, and now e6. Ludwig getting that Dutch setup. And now bishop g3 from Sardoche. More principled would have been a move that grabs the center like c4, or simply a developing move like knight to f3, or bishop to d3. But I think this bishop to g3 move is part of the London setup, so I guess it's okay in that sense. It's just not the most principled move. We have b6 from Ludwig, looking to fianchetto that light squared bishop, and knight to d2 from Sardoche. Continuing development, we have bishop to b7 and knight g to f3, and bishop to d6 from Ludwig. And you should be wary about putting this bishop on d6. I think the bishop is better placed on e7 in the Dutch defense, and the reason is, especially in this position, here white can take this bishop and give you double pawns. And now it's kind of tricky to make a break in the center. You don't want to play e5 because you've already played f5, and you would majorly weaken this diagonal, which you could be susceptible to tactics later on. And if you play d5 and try to keep the position closed, then your bishop on b7 is just extremely bad. So this is just something to be aware of when you play this bishop d6 move. But Sardoche doesn't take this bishop, which is totally fine too. And we have bishop to d3 from Sardoche, just continuing to develop. And here Ludwig plays bishop takes g3, which I actually don't like very much, because now it gives Sardoche the option of taking this pawn, or taking this bishop with the h-pawn and opening up the h-file. And you could be attacked on the h-file. White will definitely use this h-file to attack you later in the game. Like white's rook, it's already doing stuff, and it hasn't even moved yet. So you're basically allowing white's rook to get into the game for free here. And this does happen on board. Sardoche does take with the h-pawn, and let's see how the game turned out. And let's see if Sardoche punishes Ludwig for allowing him to get this semi-open h-file. We have castles from Ludwig. Once again, you got to be careful castling into this semi-open h-file. Maybe it would have been better to develop the queen and the knight and go queenside instead. But we have castles kingside and queen to e2 from Sardoche. Sardoche now recognizing that castling kingside will not be as strong because it will take his rook off of this open file, and also the pawn structure is weaker on the king side. So queenside is definitely the way to go from Sardoche, and I think he recognizes that here. We have queen to e7 from Ludwig, developing that queen. I think c5 would have been stronger here, just striking in the center, but queen to e7 is a fine move as well. And Sardoche castles queenside. We have knight to e4 now, and rook to h4 from Sardoche, and Sardoche is looking to double his rooks on this h-file. We have d5 now from Ludwig, which is a fine move. It's kind of tricky to play here as Ludwig. I think d5 is a fine move. You do shut in your bishop, but it's also, I think what Ludwig is trying to do here is just keep the position closed, which is definitely something you want to do when you're sort of defending. And black is defending here. White is going to get an attack going on this king side here. Black is behind in development, and it's going to take them a long time to try to get something going on the queen side. So we have d5, which is a fine move, and rook d to h1. Sardoche doubles on that h-file. We have h6 from Ludwig, defending this h-pawn. This is the only move from black, I think. And knight to e5 from Sardoche. getting more attackers, and also threatening this knight to g6 move. Here, you don't really want to play queen to f6 to defend against this fork, because now it's going to be very hard to develop this knight, because if you move this knight, then you get forked on d7. I also have queen to e8. Yeah, queen to e8 is the best move here. Queen to d8 actually fails to a really interesting tactic, which is rook takes h6. And the reason is after g takes h6 and rook takes g6, now there's rook g6 ideas. And it's just very tricky. I'm not going to continue showing the lines, but white does have this rook sacrifice after queen d8, which is why the queen is better placed on e8, because it guards this g6 square. It's really complicated, so I'm not going to get further into it, but that tactic was available. Even though, I mean, even if black did play this queen d8 move, though, I would be extremely surprised if Sardoche saw this rook sacrifice tactic. But we don't have any of those moves from Ludwig. Instead, we have queen to g5, and we have now. I don't think this is the best move, because there's this knight d to f3, and the queen has to move again, basically. So I don't think this queen to g5 move was the best from Ludwig. But Sardoche doesn't play knight d to f3. Instead, he plays rook 1 to h3. So I think he wants to play f3 and kick this knight out, but he's worried about dropping his g3 pawn. We have knight to c6 now from Ludwig, and this is definitely very good. We have rook to h5, kicking that queen out, and here you have to play queen to d8 as Ludwig, because if you go to f6, then you get forked on d7, and if you go to e7, then you get forked on g6. So you have to go to d8 here as Ludwig after rook h5, but Ludwig does go to f6, and pretty much immediately after he made this move, Ludwig saw that he was getting forked on d7, and Sardoche saw it too, because he played knight to d7. We have queen g6 now, and knight takes f8, and Sardoche is now up the exchange. But maybe it's actually good for Ludwig, because this white knight that Sardoche used to have was probably one of white's best pieces, and so maybe it's good that black doesn't have to deal with it. White's attack is sort of fizzled out now, but they still are up the exchange, so this is definitely good for white here. Here we have knight to f1 from Sardoche, and we have knight to b4 from Ludwig, so just trying to get some stuff going on the queen side, maybe preparing c5. And here Ludwig actually has a really sneaky threat, which is knight takes a2, and it doesn't matter if the king goes to b1 or d1, then Ludwig could play knight to c3 check, and the b pawn does defend, so you could take this once, but then black can take with the other knight, knight takes c3, and win the queen with a fork. So here you actually have to take this knight, bishop takes e4, just getting rid of one of those knights, and after f takes e4 or d takes e4, now you can play a3 and be fine. However, Sardoche, he was defending this f pawn because he wanted to, he was defending this g pawn because he wanted to play f3. That was his plan, and now he goes ahead and does it. He plays f3. I think he thinks, and maybe Ludwig also thought this, that if knight takes a2, then king b1, and two knights are hanging, and you can't save both of them. So maybe Sardoche thought knight takes a2 wasn't possible here. But here, Ludwig could have gone for knight takes a2, and after king b1 or king d1, it's the same thing. Now knight to c3, and you can take this once, but then knight takes c3 again, and you're getting forked. So king b2, knight takes e2, and bishop takes e2, and black went from being down in exchange to being up a queen for a rook and a knight. So this would definitely be very good for black, and white's king has no safety. So it's always good when your opponent's king has no safety and you have a queen and they do not. Yeah, black would definitely be winning here. But Ludwig did not go for this after f3. He instead played knight takes d3 check. So he missed that tactic. He had that win there. Unfortunately, he didn't see it. And after c takes d3, knight g5, we have rook 3 to h4, saving that rook, and now bishop to a6, pinning this pawn against the queen. I think this is very good, and black is probably already back in this game. You know, this h-rook could get trapped in a couple moves. This knight is sort of out of the game, and white just doesn't really have an attack going. I think this is, once again, a game. We have f4 from Sardoche, and this actually allows this knight to e4, very tricky move from Ludwig, and this is hitting the g-pawn. If you try to save the g-pawn with g4, now there's c5, and black can open up the c-file and get a very nice attack going on the c-file. You can never take this knight because the pawn is still pinned to the queen. So Ludwig could have gone for this knight to e4, but instead we have knight to h7, so looking at this knight to f6 and trapping this h5 rook. We have g4, and now f takes g4 from Ludwig, rook takes g4, and this hangs the h rook, but not really, because if queen takes h4, then rook takes g7, and if king takes g7, then white will win the queen. Well, you don't really have a choice. You kind of have to take this rook. But yeah, this will be very good for white if this happens. So Ludwig sees this, and after f takes g4, rook takes g4, he knows that he cannot take this h5 rook. Instead, he plays queen takes d3 and takes this free pawn on d3, which is takeable, and this is definitely a very good move from Ludwig. We have a queen trade, queen takes d3, and bishop takes d3. Now the knight is hit, and here you have to play rook to h1, defending the knight as white. If you play knight to g3, now there's this knight to f6 fork, and if you play somewhere else like knight to d2, then there's bishop to e2, and if knight to f3, then simply you can take this knight first, and now there's this knight to f6 fork. So yeah, you basically have to protect your knight, you have to protect against this skewer, and you have to protect against the knight fork, and the only thing that does all of those is this rook to h1 move. So you have to play rook to h1, but Sardoche plays knight to g3, and after knight to f6, Ludwig does see this knight fork. We have a game again, rook gh4, knight takes h5, and rook takes h5, and black is probably doing better here because they've got the bishop versus knight in the endgame, and this rook it might take a little while for this rook to get back into the game. I think black is definitely better here. We have king to h7, and now king to d2, attacking the bishop, bishop to g6, hitting the rook, and rook to e5, rook to f6 now, defending this e-pawn, and king to c3, getting the king into the game. As you should activate your king in the endgame. We have bishop to e8 now, sort of creating a wall, so now this king can never come in. The pawn defends a5 and c5, the bishop defends b5. So this is a very good move from Ludwig, in my opinion. We have king to b4, and here you can simply play a5 and force the king to go back and advance your pawn. But instead, there's also this rook to g6 move from Ludwig, which it's a skewer on this knight and this g-pawn, so you're going to be losing one of them. We could see something like knight to f5, and if you take this knight, then we have bishop takes e8. We still have rook takes g2, and black is up 2 pawns here, so this will be a winning endgame for black. But instead of either of these moves, we have, after king b4, we have g6 from Ludwig. So definitely a couple better moves in this position for Ludwig, but g6 is not the worst move either. We have a4 now from Sardoche and h5 from Ludwig, a5 from Sardoche, and here you definitely don't want to take this, because if you take this, you allow white's king to get very active. If you don't take this, white's king still cannot do anything. If they push the pawn, white's king is still blocked off. If they take you, you just take back, and white's king is still blocked off. So here you just have to not take and be totally fine. But unfortunately for Ludwig, he takes, b takes a5 check, and after king takes a5, now white is arguably doing better. It's still probably fairly, it's hard to say, but white's king is very active. So let's just see how the game continued. We have h4 from Ludwig and knight to e2 from Sardoche, saving that knight. Rook to f5 now, and this is a terrible move from Ludwig because it hangs this e6 pawn. So will Sardoche see this rook takes e6 move? No, he doesn't. He doesn't actually go for this rook takes e6, which would have won on the spot, basically. We have king to a6 instead, and now after rook takes e5, d takes e5, black actually wins here with c5. So basically, if king takes a7 now we have bishop to b5, skewering the knight to the f1 square. The knight can't defend from the g3 square, so the knight could come to c1, for example, and now bishop f1 and the g-pawn will be lost, and there will be this passed h-pawn. So we could have a continuation like knight to b3, bishop takes g2, knight takes c5 and h3 now, but the knight can actually come back and defend in time, so knight to d3 and h2 and knight to f2, and you wouldn't want to promote here as white and force white, or sorry, you wouldn't want to promote here as black and force white to give up the knight, because then they have this passed b pawn and it ends up being a draw. You'd have to likely sack your bishop for this passed b pawn, and it would just be a draw. So instead here you have to go for this g5 move, and this is basically clearance, because you want to get your king in and kick this knight away, but you can't play king h6 because it's a fork. It would be a fork on g4. So you have to play g5 here, and this is how black wins this endgame after this d takes e5 move. You have to play c5 here. But instead of c5, we have king to h6, and endgames are just really tricky. I think that's the lesson from this game, is just endgames are really tricky. We have king to h6 from Ludwig, and this now allows white to get back in the game. Now white can play king to h7 safely, and so Ludwig here goes for c5, but it doesn't work because now there's king to b6. We have c4, and now you couldn't play bishop b5 here, so we have c4 instead, saving the c pawn, and now we have king to c5. We have king h5 from Ludwig, and now this actually allows white to win after king d6, and this would basically win the e pawn. You'd have a passed e pawn, and black would have to give up this bishop for this passed e pawn. If you try to defend with bishop f7, there's simply king e7, king g8, or bishop g8 is the only safe square, but now there's king f8. Now h7 is the only safe square, but now there's king g7, and now the bishop is trapped. So this would still be winning for white, and that's how you win this game as white after king h5. But instead we have e4 from Sardoche, and here you have to take this pawn. You have to play d takes e4 as Ludwig. Any other move is not as good, including the one that Ludwig played, bishop f7, which really, the reason why you have to take here is because if you try to defend your pawn and play a move like bishop f7, now white gets a passed pawn after e takes d5 and e takes d5, which happened in the game, and now this e pawn is passed, and it's going to be very hard for black to defend. It's actually winning after king to d6, which Sardoche played in the game. Ludwig played g5, and now we have e6 from Sardoche. f5 would have been the cleanest win. This g5 move is definitely not good, because now it allows white to get two connected passed pawns on the 5th rank, and this bishop cannot stop these three pieces. One of them will become a new queen, or both of them. So yeah, this f5 move would have been the cleanest win, but we have e6 instead, which is also winning. Ludwig plays bishop to g6, and now this, in case I can't remember if I said this, but this position is definitely very winning for white. We have f takes g5. King takes d5 is also winning here, but f takes g5 also wins. King takes g5, and now king takes d5. We have bishop to d3 defending this c4 pawn and hitting the knight, but this is the problem with this passed pawn. It's just too far advanced up the board, because white, Sardoche, does not even need to move or defend his knight. He simply plays e7, and you don't have time to take this knight because white will make a new queen if you do. So Ludwig plays his bishop back to g6, and let's see if Sardoche can convert this endgame now. We have king to d6 and king to f6 going after that passed pawn, but the white king defends, and you can never attack this passed pawn with your bishop. We have knight... Oh, sorry about that. We have knight to f4, now attacking this bishop, and Ludwig saves it with bishop to e8. We have knight to d5 check and king to f7, knight to e3 and bishop to b5, saving this c4 pawn. But now we have knight to f5 going after this h4 pawn, and you can't save the h4 pawn. If you push it, then it simply gets captured. So we have king to e8 now, and Sardoche picks up this h4 pawn, knight takes h4. We have bishop a4, and with Sardoche picking up this h4 pawn, he now has two passed pawns. We have bishop to a4, and now g4 from Sardoche, pushing that other passed pawn. Bishop to d1, going after it, and g5. Bishop to h5, and here you can play g6 as, the knight defends the g6 square, but Sardoche instead plays knight to f5, threatening knight to g7. So we have bishop to g6 attacking the knight, blocking the pawn, but we have knight to g7 anyway, and now the king is forced away and the pawn will promote on the next turn. So we have king to f7, the only move, and e8 equals queen. King takes g7, but now white is up a queen. So we have queen to e7 check and king to g8, queen to e6 check and king to h7, queen to f6 and king to g8. There's nothing Ludwig can do here. King to e7, king to h7, king to f8, now threatening queen to g7, checkmate, and black can do nothing to stop this. So here Ludwig played bishop h5 and Sardoche played queen g7, which is a checkmate. So Sardoche takes the first game in a very long and hard-fought game, but both sides had many chances. Both sides had many blunders. So we'll just have to see if Ludwig can take us to a tiebreaker in game 2 or if Sardoche will shut out Ludwig and advance to the finals. We'll just have to see. Yeah, both of these players played very well in this game. A lot of advanced ideas, both positional and tactical. So congrats to them. They both played a very nice game here. I don't think I have anything else to say about this game, so check out my PogChamps 3 playlist up there and check out the next game of this match on the left side of the screen. Stay awesome, like and subscribe. I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.